A quiet seamstress walks down an aisle no one chose for her. A feared biker leader shocks the world with one public promise: money, a ruined hospital, and a pledge to help forgotten veterans. The town cheers, the cameras roar, and then the attacks start. Arson, fake papers, and a whisper of a hidden debt tied to her father. Now she must run the rescue while strangers try to tear it all down. Will she protect the truth and the people who need her? Or will the secret behind that wedding gift destroy them all? The morning sunlight filtered through threadbare curtains, casting pale shadows across the worn linoleum floor of the Hayes kitchen. May moved with the measured grace of someone who had spent years navigating hospital corridors, her hand steady as she poured coffee into 3 chipped enamel mugs. The familiar scent of the dark brew filled the small space, momentarily masking the lingering smell of yesterday's fish dinner and the faint mustiness of a house that needed repairs they couldn't afford. Nora sat at the kitchen table, her fingers working carefully over the hem of a simple linen dress. The client needed it by tomorrow, and the extra dollars would help with groceries. Her needle flashed in the morning light, making tiny, perfect stitches almost invisible to the untrained eye. The fabric felt cool beneath her fingertips as she worked, her mind calculating how many more jobs she'd need this month to make ends meet. She could hear Tommy shifting uncomfortably on the couch in the living room, trying to find a position that didn't hurt his swollen ankle. The springs creaked in protest with each movement. "You need ice on that," May called out, her voice carrying the practiced patience of a mother and nurse combined. She wrapped a dish towel around a small bundle of ice cubes, the water dripping between her fingers as she secured it. "It's fine, Ma," Tommy muttered, but the pain in his voice was clear. Another shuffle, another wince that carried across the small house. Nora's eyes drifted to the stack of papers on the counter, overdue notices in red ink, a loan shark's ledger with numbers that made her stomach twist. Their father's medical bills had started it, and now the debt seemed to grow no matter how many extra sewing jobs she took on. Electric bills, water bills, the mortgage payment circled twice in red. They multiplied like weeds choking out hope. The interest alone was more than they could manage each month. The knock on the door came just as May was settling into her chair, her worn slippers scuffing against the floor as she paused, coffee mug halfway to her lips. 3 sharp raps that made Tommy go quiet in the other room. The silence that followed was thick with apprehension. May set her mug down and smoothed her faded house dress before answering the door. Nora's fingers stilled on her needlework, her breath caught somewhere between her throat and chest. A woman stood on their porch, leather jacket gleaming in the morning. Sun, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her stance was confident, almost challenging, as she surveyed their modest home with quick, assessing eyes. "Rosa," she introduced herself curtly. "I work for Marco Valente." The name hung in the air like a thundercloud. She held out a sealed envelope, the cream-colored paper incongruously elegant against her calloused fingers. "This needs to be discussed. Now." May's face went still, the lines around her mouth deepening. But she invited Rosa in with the politeness that never left her, even in crisis. "Please come in. We can talk in the kitchen." Her voice was steady, revealing nothing of the fear Nora could see in the slight tremor of her mother's hands. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, heavy stationery with precise typewritten words. Nora read it twice, her hands growing cold, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. A marriage contract. To Marco Valente. The loan shark they owed money to. The man whose crew member Tommy had gotten into a fight with last night. The terms were laid out with brutal efficiency. Her hand in marriage for the erasure of their debt and protection for her family. Tommy's little scuffle could have consequences, Rosa said, her voice matter-of-fact as she leaned against the doorframe. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, never left Nora's face. This takes care of both problems. The debt disappears, and so does the trouble. Marco's a man who honors his agreements. She's 19, May said quietly, but Nora could hear the calculation in her mother's voice, weighing options that weren't really options at all. Her mother's fingers worried at the cross she always wore around her neck, a gift from Nora's father before he died. "Ma, you can't let her," Tommy called from the living room, voice cracking with panic and shame. The couch springs protested as he tried to stand. "It's my fault. I'll fix it somehow." "Quiet, Thomas," May said, and Tommy fell silent, but Nora could hear his ragged breathing, the soft thump as he fell back onto the couch. Rosa waited, patient as a cat watching a mouse hole. Her jacket creaked slightly as she shifted her weight. "Marco's offering a fair deal. More than fair, considering. Your debt's wiped clean, protection for your family. Many would consider it generous." Nora stared at the paper until the words blurred before her eyes. The signature line at the bottom seemed to pulse like a challenge. She thought of her mother's cough getting worse, the medicine they couldn't afford. The way May tried to hide her wheezing at night. Thought of Tommy's face, pale with fear and guilt, the purple bruise spreading across his cheekbone, matching his swollen ankle. "I need time to think," she managed, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Until tomorrow morning," Rosa said, standing and straightening her jacket. Her boots made solid sounds on the floor as she moved toward the door. "We'll send a car, 8 o'clock. She paused at the Ifumauasim threshold, something almost like sympathy flickering across her features. For what it's worth, he's not the worst option. He keeps his word. The rest of the day passed in a fog of whispered arguments and long silences. May made soup no one ate, the vegetables floating untouched in broth that grew cold. Tommy apologized until his voice gave out, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate as he begged Nora to run away, to let him handle it somehow. At dusk, Nora slipped out the back door, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the evening chill. She walked to the shore, her feet finding the familiar path to the beach without conscious thought. The sand shifted beneath her worn sneakers as she made her way to the water's edge. The waves rolled in, steady and uncaring, the same rhythm they'd kept since long before her problems existed. She thought of her father, who had taught her that dignity mattered more than comfort, who had worked 2 jobs until his heart gave out. Thought of the carefully hidden pill bottles in May's drawer, the prescriptions half filled because they couldn't afford more. The small, racking cough that May tried to muffle with a dishcloth when she thought no one was listening. The injustice of it burned in her throat, hot and acidic as tears threatened to spill. The fading light painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, beautiful and indifferent to her plight. But as the sun sank into the ocean, casting long shadows across the sand, Nora knew what she would do. For her mother's failing health, for Tommy's future, she would marry Marco Valente. She would find a way to keep her dignity inside this bargain. She would turn this sacrifice into something she could live with, somehow. The waves kept rolling in as darkness fell, the distant lights of boats glittering on the horizon like false promises. Nora brushed the sand from her hands and turned toward home, her shoulders straight, her decision made. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, back to tell her family what tomorrow would bring. Dawn crept through the window as Nora stood before the mirror in her small bedroom. The dress she'd mended hung simply on her frame, its clean lines a testament to careful work. Each stitch invisible, each seam perfectly aligned. It was the best of her limited wardrobe, a pale blue cotton that had faded slightly from countless washings, but still held its shape with dignity. May stood behind her, weathered hands smoothing invisible wrinkles from the fabric with the tenderness that had seen Nora through every important moment of her life, from first days of school to her father's funeral. "Turn around, sweetheart," May whispered, picking up the wooden hairbrush from the dresser. The brush had been her mother's before her, the handle worn smooth from generations of women preparing for life's crossroads. Her fingers, though stiff with arthritis, worked with practiced ease as she sectioned Nora's dark hair. The familiar rhythm of braiding brought tears to Nora's eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to begin this day with weeping. "Remember what your father used to say?" May asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her eyes in the mirror held the same quiet strength they'd shown through every hardship the family had weathered. "Dignity isn't in what happens to you," Nora recited softly, fingertips brushing the small silver cross at her throat, "but in how you face it." The words felt different today, heavier, more urgent than when her father had spoken them over minor childhood disappointments. May secured the braid with a ribbon, something blue, something old, a scrap of satin from her own wedding dress carefully preserved all these years. Then she closed her eyes, lips moving in silent prayer, her grip on Nora's shoulders tightening momentarily. Nora joined her, the words more comfort than conviction this morning, but she clung to them anyway, a lifeline in uncertain waters. The small trunk by the door held everything Nora would take. 2 dresses carefully folded between tissue paper, her mother's handed-down Bible with its leather cover cracked from use, the quilt May had made for her high school graduation with each square representing a family memory, and a handful of photographs in a small wooden frame. Her father in his police uniform, Tommy missing his front teeth, May laughing in their garden. It seemed strange that 19 years could fit in such a small space, a life distilled to essentials. Outside, the town was already buzzing with anticipation and judgment. Mrs. Peterson from next door stood on her porch in her faded housecoat, phone pressed to her ear, not even pretending not to stare, her mouth moving rapidly as she passed along whatever information she believed she possessed. Reverend Mills walked past with hurried steps, his face a mask of disapproval as he hurried towards the church, Bible clutched to his chest like armor. A van from Channel 5 News crawled down their street, the reporter inside scribbling notes while the cameraman adjusted equipment on his lap. "They're saying there's more news vans headed to the compound," Tommy said from the doorway, his voice thick with guilt and shame. He leaned heavily on his crutch, the bruise on his face darker than yesterday, purple spreading beneath his left eye. His shoulders hunched forward as though trying to make himself smaller, disappear entirely. "Nora, he started, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. The police cruiser arrived exactly at 9 o'clock, tires crunching on the gravel of their modest driveway. Officer Dan Miller stepped out, his face troubled beneath his professional demeanor. Deep lines etched between his eyebrows as he removed his hat. He'd known their family for years, had worked with their father on the force, had attended the funeral and brought casseroles for weeks after. "I'm sorry about this, May," he said quietly, helping load Nora's trunk into the back seat. His uniform looked freshly pressed, as though he'd taken extra care today. "If there was any other way—" He let the sentence hang, unfinished, in the morning air. The drive through town felt like a slow-motion parade of everything Nora was leaving behind. They passed the diner where she'd worked summers, where regular customers knew her by name and left her little notes with their tips. The library where she'd studied for college entrance exams, dreams now suspended indefinitely. The park where her father had taught her to ride a bike, his steady hand on the seat until she found her balance, his proud voice calling after her. As they headed toward the outskirts, the signs of Marco King's influence became more apparent. A clubhouse wall bore fresh graffiti. Some angry words crossed out, some respectful tributes added in bold colors. Outside the Veterans Hall, 3 old soldiers in faded military caps nodded as the cruiser passed, their weathered faces showing none of the fear others displayed at Marco's name, only a complicated respect that Nora couldn't fully understand. A burned-out motorcycle lay like a warning sign on the shoulder of the highway, its chrome still gleaming despite the char, black rubber melted into the asphalt. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers unconsciously touching the bruise on his face, his eyes fixed on the wreckage as they drove past. The compound appeared ahead, sprawling behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire that glinted like diamonds in the strengthening sun. Metal buildings and workshops dotted the property, with several trailers arranged in a loose semicircle near the back. A rusted sign swung on its hinges. Private property, no trespassing. But there, tied to the gate's padlock, was an unexpected touch of grace, a bouquet of wild Queen Anne's lace and black-eyed Susans, their delicate white and gold faces turning toward the light, Rosa's silent message of welcome amidst the harshness. Officer Miller pulled up to the gate, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The noon sun cast harsh shadows through the fence, transforming the chain links into a pattern of diamonds across Nora's lap. Somewhere inside, a dog barked, the sound echoing across the compound. A motorcycle engine revved in the distance, then fell silent. Nora took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin, steadying herself for what came next, for the moment when the gate would open and her new life would begin. The Valente Clubhouse Chapel smelled of leather and lingering incense. Nora stood at the back, her fingers twisting the small bouquet of wildflowers Rosa had pressed into her hands. Through the open doors, she could see the strange mix of guests. Burly men in leather vests sitting awkwardly in folding chairs beside a handful of townspeople who looked ready to bolt. 2 ministers stood at the front, one Catholic and one Protestant, both shifting nervously as they arranged their books. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty, stained glass, casting pools of colored light across a floor that had seen better days. Tommy squeezed her hand before limping to his seat. May touched Nora's cheek one last time, whispering, "Stand tall, sweetheart," before taking her place in the front row. The wedding march played from a scratchy portable speaker. Nora took her first step down the aisle, careful of the worn carpet runner. She kept her eyes forward, aware of the cameras clicking softly from the back corners where 2 approved journalists stood. And then she saw Marco. He stood like a statue at the altar, 35 years carved in sharp lines across his face. His dark suit looked expensive, but sat uneasily on his broad shoulders, more used to leather than fine wool. When their eyes met, she saw guardedness there, but something else too, a flicker of uncertainty that made him suddenly human. As she drew closer, details emerged. A small scar across his right knuckle, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, a single gray thread in his black hair. He didn't smile, but his eyes never left her face. The ceremony itself felt rushed, words tumbling over each other in the electric silence. Nora's "I do" came out steady, surprising her. Marco's voice was low and rough when he spoke his vows, his hand warm but gentle when he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. But instead of kissing his bride, Marco turned to face the gathered crowd. He moved to a battered wooden table that had been set up to one side, its surface covered with legal documents. The room held its collective breath. Today isn't just about a marriage, he said, his voice filling the chapel. "It's about making things right." He picked up a pen and began signing papers with swift, decisive strokes. The King's Pledge, a public trust, is now the legal owner of all liquid assets from our operations, along with the deed to the old Veterans Hospital on Mill Road. Cameras clicked rapidly as he held up the signed documents. "Everything goes to helping the vets we've ignored too long. It's time we served them instead of ourselves." In the back row, an elderly veteran in a faded service cap wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. The journalists whispered frantically into their phones. Rosa stood in the corner, a rare smile on his weathered face. Through the chapel windows, Nora could see the compound's gates swinging open. News vans were already lining up, their satellite dishes reaching toward the darkening sky like metal flowers. The world was about to crash in on them, but for this moment, she watched her new husband's face as he looked at the veteran who was crying, and saw something that looked almost like peace. May reached over and squeezed Nora's hand, whispering, "Sometimes dignity comes in the strangest packages, doesn't it?" Nora stared at the ceiling of the clubhouse guest room as dawn crept, through thin curtains. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, but sleep had been impossible. Marco's words from the wedding kept echoing in her mind, his rough voice carrying a weight she hadn't expected. The radio on the bedside table crackled with morning news. In a shocking turn of events, notorious motorcycle club leader Marco King has transferred millions in assets to a veterans trust fund during his wedding ceremony yesterday. Critics call it a publicity stunt, while supporters praise. She clicked it off, but couldn't escape the buzz of media attention. Even through the walls, she could hear vehicles arriving outside, their engines mixing with shouted questions from reporters. Her phone lit up with a text from Tommy. "You okay? TV's going crazy. Mom's making pancakes and telling everyone to mind their business." A smile tugged at her lips as she imagined May in their kitchen, probably serving breakfast to curious neighbors while maintaining her nurse's calm. The next message showed exactly that, a photo of their porch crowded with people from town, some offering casseroles, others clearly there to gossip. The morning crawled by in a haze of phone calls and muffled conversations from the hallway. Around noon, Rosa knocked softly, delivering a message that Reverend Elsie from the First Methodist Church wanted to speak with them. "She's with Samir Patel, the lawyer who handles most of the town's charitable trusts," he explained, his usual gruffness softened with respect. Nora found Marco in his office, shoulders tense as he worked through stacks of paperwork. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Your reverend and the lawyer want to help," she said quietly. "They think they can structure the trust properly, make sure everything's legal and transparent." Marco nodded slowly. "Good. We'll need people the town trusts." He stood up, pacing to the window. The afternoon sun caught the gray at his temples, the shadows under his eyes. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "There's something you should know." He led her to a small room she hadn't seen before, its walls covered with old photographs. Veterans in uniform, younger versions of some of the men she'd seen at the wedding. Marco touched one picture gently. "These men saved my life," he said, his voice rough. "Not just in combat. After, when I was lost." His fingers traced the frame. "I watched too many of them slip through the cracks when they came home. Good men who deserved better." He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw raw honesty in his eyes. "This isn't a stunt, Nora. I owe them. We all do." The moment stretched between them, fragile and real. Then Rosa appeared at the door, his face tight. In his hand was a crumpled note, clearly slipped under the main door. The paper trembled slightly in his usually steady grip. "Boss," he said quietly. You need to see this." Marco read it, his jaw clenching. Without a word, he passed it to Nora. The Ossawa message was short, typed in plain black letters. "Money and marriage won't wash the blood off your hands. Some debts can only be paid in red." The fluorescent lights of Coastal First Bank hummed overhead as Marco signed another document. Samir Patel, looking crisp in his navy suit, pointed to each marked line with practiced patience. Rosa stood guard by the door, arms crossed, watching the bank employees whisper behind their computers. "Initial here," Samir said, sliding another form forward. "This establishes the trust's charitable status and tax exemption requirements." The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, peered over his glasses with barely concealed skepticism. "And the source of these funds, Mr. King?" "All legitimate business proceeds," Marco answered evenly. "Every dollar accounted for and documented." Nora sat quietly beside them, taking notes in her small notebook. 3 days of paperwork had taught her more about financial terms than she'd ever expected to learn. Her neat handwriting filled pages with words like endowment and disbursement schedule. Later that afternoon, they stood before the old Veterans Memorial Hospital. The building loomed against the gray sky, its red brick facade dulled by years of neglect. Paint peeled from the window frames like curling ribbons, and rust had claimed the metal doors. "It's got good bones," said Hank, the retired Marine who'd volunteered to help coordinate. His weathered face creased as he studied the building. "Needs work, but we can bring her back." 2 local nurses, Sarah Chen and Mike Rodriguez, walked the perimeter with clipboards, making notes about medical equipment needs. The town hall representative, Janet Foster, trailed behind them with pursed lips and crossed arms. "This is an enormous undertaking," Janet said, her voice sharp with doubt. "The liability alone—" "Will be covered," Marco cut in. He turned to Nora. "I want you to oversee the renovation planning. You've got an eye for detail and people trust you." Nora blinked in surprise. "Me? But I've never—" "You understand both sides of town," he said quietly. "And I've seen how you organize. We need that." That evening, Nora sat cross-legged on her new bed in the clubhouse, sorting through the few belongings she'd brought from home. At the bottom of her trunk, she found her father's old Bible. She'd packed it without thinking, a habit of keeping his memory close. As she opened it, a folded paper slipped from between the pages. Her heart jumped at the sight of her father's handwriting. "My dearest Nora, there's something you should know. Years ago, when the fishing boat caught fire, it was Antonio King, Marco's father, who helped us rebuild. I never told your mother, but that debt saved our family. The Kings have their reputation, but they understand honor. Sometimes grace comes from unexpected places. Love, Dad." Nora pressed the letter to her chest, pieces clicking into place. The marriage arrangement wasn't just about Tommy's trouble. It was an old debt being called in, transformed into something new. By midnight, the hospital's entrance hall buzzed with activity. Rosa directed volunteers hanging tarps, while Marco and Hank hauled in donated paint cans. The harsh work lights cast long shadows as people moved back and forth, carrying tools borrowed from all over town. Nora stood in the doorway, her father's letter tucked safely in her pocket, watching this unlikely group work together. She saw Marco pause to help an elderly volunteer with a heavy box, his movements careful and kind. Perhaps her father had been right about grace and unexpected places. The first Monday dawned bright and cold, with a sharp winter clarity that made the old hospital building look both forlorn and full of possibility. Nora arrived at the site when the sun was still climbing the eastern sky, her breath making little clouds in the chilly air. Her clipboard was clutched tightly against her chest, filled with neatly written lists and schedules she'd spent the weekend perfecting. She found Hank already there, methodically sweeping decades of dust and neglect from the entrance hall, the scratch of his broom against the tile floors echoing through the empty corridors. "Morning, boss lady," he said with a gentle smile that crinkled the weathered corners of his eyes. His calloused hands never stopped working as he spoke. "Got the coffee brewing in what used to be the nurse's station. Nothing fancy, but it's hot and strong, the way we learned to drink it overseas." Throughout that first day, volunteers trickled in like a hesitant stream that gradually gained confidence. They scraped old paint from walls with putty knives and wire brushes, their arms aching but spirits surprisingly high. Laughter occasionally bounced off the bare walls as someone told a joke or shared a story. Nora organized them into teams with the precision of a battlefield commander, matching stronger backs with steadier hands, placing the chattier workers with the quiet ones to create a balance. By afternoon, Mr. Peterson from the bank arrived, his polished brown leather shoes and pressed slacks looking comically out of place among the dust and debris. "We'll need detailed expense reports," he said, frowning at the renovation plans spread across a makeshift table of sawhorses and plywood. His fountain pen tapped an impatient rhythm against his notepad. "Every receipt, every invoice, the trust has strict guidelines about documentation." "I'm keeping track of everything," Nora assured him, showing her meticulous notes, color-coded and organized by date and category. The pages were already smudged with fingerprints and dust, but the numbers lined up perfectly. Mr. Peterson's eyebrows lifted slightly, impressed despite himself. Tuesday brought more progress, and a surprise that set the whole neighborhood buzzing. Marco arrived with a thunderous procession of motorcycles, their engines echoing down the quiet streets as they approached. The line of bikes pulled up to the curb, their sidecars and saddlebags loaded with supplies, paint rollers, drop cloths, and boxes of cleaning supplies. "Club bikes," he explained to Nora's questioning look, his eyes meeting hers briefly before glancing away. He ran his hand along the chrome handlebar of the nearest motorcycle, an unexpected tenderness in the gesture. "Better use than collecting dust in storage. Figured they could help us haul stuff." The rumble of engines drew curious onlookers from blocks around. Some neighbors watched cautiously from their porches, arms crossed and expressions wary. Others, overcome by curiosity or perhaps sensing the change in the air, ventured closer. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes brought a tray of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. A young couple arrived with a cooler of cold drinks and shy smiles. That evening, as sunset painted the windows in shades of amber and gold, Hank gathered the tired volunteers in the cleared cafeteria. Dust motes danced in the slanted light as he cleared his throat. His voice, normally gruff and commanding, grew soft as he spoke about his time there as a young Marine, fresh from conflict and broken in ways that didn't show on the outside. "This place saved my life back in '85, he said, his gaze distant as if seeing ghosts in the shadowed corners. "Doc Matthews wouldn't give up on any of us. Not the ones who couldn't sleep, not the ones who couldn't walk, not even the ones who said they didn't want to live anymore. We need that spirit again. This town needs it. Our veterans need it." The room fell silent, except for the occasional sniff, as someone wiped away a tear they hoped no one would notice. Wednesday hit its first snag when Conrad Matthews, a local developer with slick hair and an expensive suit, stormed into the site. His Italian leather shoes kicked up dust as he marched through the entrance, his face flushed red with anger as he confronted Marco near the reception area. "I had plans for this property," he shouted, waving a folder of blueprints. Spittle flew from his lips as his voice echoed down the hallways. 6 months negotiating with the county, luxury condos that would have raised property values, and you swoop in with this charity stunt. The deed's transferred, Marco cut in, his voice calm, but with an underlying steel that made several workers pause their tasks to watch. Legal and binding, nothing to discuss. His stance was relaxed, hands loose at his sides, but anyone who knew him could sense the coiled tension beneath the surface. Later that evening, during the town council meeting in the wood-paneled chamber of the municipal building, Councilman Peters made his disapproval clear with every word he drawled from behind the raised dais. "While we appreciate charitable intentions," he said, looking down his nose at the gathered citizens, "we must consider the element this might attract. Veterans with troubles, outsiders, from who knows where. Is this really what our peaceful community needs?" Nora, sitting stiffly in a hard wooden chair in the back row, watched Marco's jaw tighten at the thinly veiled insult. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his seat, but remarkably, he remained silent. The muscle jumping in his cheek was the only sign of the storm brewing inside him. Thursday and Friday blurred together in a haze of work and small victories. Walls were primed to a clean white, broken windows replaced, and ancient plumbing coaxed back to life with a chorus of groans and clanks. Nora developed a system for meal rotations, coordinating with local churches and restaurants to ensure workers didn't go hungry. Her phone rang constantly, her voice growing hoarse as she thanked donors and scheduled deliveries. Through it all, she noticed how Marco always made sure the veterans ate first, often serving them himself with a deference that surprised everyone who knew his reputation. "Never seen him like this," Rosa confided to Nora, as they sorted through boxes of donated medical supplies, separating usable items from outdated ones. She paused, a roll of gauze in her hand, her dark eyes following Marco as he helped an elderly veteran navigate the cluttered hallway. "He's different around you and the vets, gentler somehow, like he's trying to prove something to himself, not just everyone else." Saturday morning revealed the first real threat, a cold splash of reality that chilled Nora more than the winter air. She arrived to find Hank standing motionless in the parking lot, his weathered face grim as he stared at the slashed tires of the supply trucks. The rubber hung in tatters, deliberately cut with something sharp and driven by malice. Fresh red paint, still glistening wet in the morning light, marked a support beam near the entrance. "Traitor!" it screamed in dripping crimson letters. Marco's face darkened when he saw it, his expression shuttering closed like a steel door. "Internal," he muttered to Rosa, their heads close together as they examined the damage. "Has to be. Someone from the old days who doesn't like the new direction." The veterans who showed up that day formed a protective circle around the site, an instinctive formation born from years of watching each other's backs in far more dangerous places. They worked with grim determination, sharing knowing looks that communicated volumes without words. Some had fresh paint splashed on their clothes, evidence of their early arrival and silent decision to cover the threatening message before Nora or other volunteers could see it. By Sunday evening, despite the setback, progress was visible everywhere you looked. Clean windows reflected the sunset in blazing orange rectangles on the opposite walls. Fresh primer covered most of the entrance hall, transforming the space from institutional neglect to a blank canvas of possibility. But tension hung in the air like static before a storm, an undercurrent of unease that made people glance over their shoulders and lower their voices when discussing plans. Nora found Marco alone in what would become the physical therapy room, a large space with high ceilings and wide windows that let in the fading light. He stood motionless, staring at old equipment they'd uncovered beneath dust cloths, parallel bars, weight machines, and rehabilitation tools that had once helped broken bodies heal. "Someone's trying to stop this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she stepped into the room. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, announcing her presence. They won't succeed." His voice was firm, but tinged with a weariness she hadn't heard before. He didn't turn to look at her, his shoulders set in a rigid line. "This matters too much, to too many people." She watched him run a hand along a dusty parallel bar, his expression distant and unreachable. For a moment, the harsh lines of his face softened, and she saw past his tough exterior to something vulnerable beneath. A man trying to rebuild more than just a building, perhaps trying to reconstruct something broken within himself. The realization made her heart constrict with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The week ended as it began, with Hank sweeping the halls in the gathering dusk. But now the broom moved over clean floors, and patches of new drywall gleamed white against the older walls. Hope had begun to take root in the building like a stubborn seedling pushing through concrete, fragile but determined despite the shadows of opposition that loomed. Nora sat on a folding chair in what would become the reception area, making one final check of her lists by the light of a temporary work lamp. She added security cameras to the top in bold letters, circling it twice, while the distant traffic hummed a lullaby to the day and the evening light faded through newly washed windows, turning the world outside to deepening shades of blue and purple. The community center buzzed with tension as people filed in, taking seats on metal folding chairs. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes, capturing every moment, every reaction. The air felt heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. Nora sat in the front row beside Marco, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with worry. She could feel the warmth of his arm next to hers, a strange comfort in this sea of scrutiny. Samir stood at the podium, his suit crisp and manner professional, the picture of confidence despite the pressure. His dark tie was perfectly centered, not a hair out of place. "We're here to discuss the King's Pledge and its impact on our community," he began, his voice steady and calm, cutting through the nervous whispers that filled the room. One by one, residents approached the microphone. Mrs. Chen from the bakery spoke first, her voice wavering, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "My son came home from overseas 3 years ago. He needed help, but the nearest VA hospital was 2 hours away. This center could save lives." Her eyes glistened with tears as she stepped back, nodding respectfully to the crowd. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Bill Cooper, who owned the hardware store, gripped the podium with white knuckles, his weathered face flushed with emotion. "We all want to help veterans, but let's be honest. Do we want certain elements in our town? Who's really running this operation?" His gaze darted accusingly toward Marco, making his meaning painfully clear. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like waves on troubled water. Some nodded in agreement, others shook their heads in disgust. Nora felt Marco tense beside her, his jaw clenching tight, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "The Trust's financial records are completely transparent," Samir interjected, holding up a thick folder stuffed with paperwork. "Every donation, every expense is documented. Nothing hidden, nothing to hide." A reporter from the local paper stood up, her press badge swinging from her neck. "But what about the marriage aspect? Isn't this just a publicity stunt?" Her pen hovered eagerly over her notepad, ready to record every word. That's when Marco touched Nora's arm gently, his fingers warm against her skin. "Tell them," he whispered, his breath tickling her ear. "Tell them why it matters." Nora's legs felt like jelly as she approached the podium, each step seeming to take forever. The microphone squealed slightly, and she flinched, the harsh sound making her stomach clench. Taking a deep breath, she looked out at the sea of familiar faces, neighbors she'd known since childhood, people who'd watched her grow up, now waiting to judge her choices. "I'm Nora Hayes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, then cleared her throat. "My mother May was a nurse for 20 years. She taught me that healing happens in small steps, one person at a time." Her voice grew stronger, steadier with each word. "Yesterday, I watched my brother Tommy help paint walls alongside a veteran who served 3 tours. They shared lunch and stories, laughed together over sandwiches and soda. That's what this center is about, bringing people together, helping each other heal." She saw heads nodding, faces softening, the ice of suspicion beginning to thaw. "We're not asking for blind trust. We're asking for a chance to prove what's possible when a community comes together. This isn't about me or Marco or any one person. It's about all of us, what we can build together." As she finished, an elderly man in the back stood up slowly, leaning on his cane, his veteran's cap worn with pride. The room hushed as he pulled out his checkbook and wrote deliberately, his hand shaking slightly with age. "For the paint fund," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, passing the check forward. "My grandson would have appreciated a place like this." Others followed suit, reaching for wallets and purses, the sound of checkbook pages turning filling the room. Children emptied piggy banks, offering handfuls of coins. A local contractor stood up, offering to donate labor for the roof repairs. Even Janet Myers, the skeptical reporter who'd been writing scathing editorials about the King's Pledge for weeks, approached Nora afterward. Her sharp eyes softened just a fraction as she tucked away her notebook. "Not bad, kid," she muttered, adjusting her glasses. "Maybe there's more to this story than I thought. I'll be watching, though." Later that evening, Nora sat with Marco in the hospital's kitchen, now partially renovated with new countertops gleaming under the overhead lights, but still missing cabinet doors. The walls were freshly painted a soft cream color that made the space feel warmer, more inviting. They shared a simple meal of sandwiches and coffee, the smell of fresh bread and strong coffee mingling pleasantly in the air. "My brother Jimmy served," Marco said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. He stared into his coffee cup, as if seeing something beyond the dark liquid. "Came back different. Quieter. I was just a kid, but I remember how he'd sit in the garage for hours, working on his bike." His voice grew softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever heard it. "One day he rode off, never came back." Nora watched his face in the dim light, seeing the pain etched there, lines of grief she hadn't noticed before. His fingers tapped restlessly against his mug. "Is that why you're doing this?" she asked gently. "Partly." He met her eyes, his gaze unexpectedly raw, honest. "Jimmy needed help, but pride got in the way. My family, we don't ask for help. Maybe if there'd been a place like this." He left the thought unfinished, but Nora understood what remained unsaid. They finished their meal in thoughtful silence, the evening light casting long shadows through the windows they'd cleaned just days before. The dust motes danced in the golden beams, somehow beautiful in their simplicity. When Nora returned to her small room in the hospital's converted staff quarters, she stopped in the doorway, her breath catching. Spread across her bed was a beautiful handmade quilt, its patterns intricate and precise, colors flowing together in a harmony that spoke of careful planning. The stitching was surprisingly delicate, each seam perfectly straight, each corner meticulously aligned. She ran her fingers over the fabric, recognizing some of the patterns from her own sewing work, marveling at the craftsmanship. Her throat tightened as she realized Marco must have made it himself. No store-bought gift could hold this level of care and attention, the tough exterior hiding such gentle skill. It seemed to sum up everything about him that had surprised her these past days, layers unfolding to reveal unexpected depths. The quilt was still warm from where it had been recently placed, as if it carried within its folds all the hope and complexity of their unusual situation. She pulled it around her shoulders, wrapping herself in this tangible proof that people could always surprise you, that beneath the surface, everyone carried unexpected gifts waiting to be shared. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital's freshly painted walls. Nora adjusted a box of donated bandages, trying to ignore the knot of worry in her stomach. Something felt off. Workers moved with nervous energy, glancing over shoulders more often than usual. Even Marco seemed tense, his jaw tight as he spoke with Rosa near the loading dock. "Did you see him?" Tommy whispered, helping Nora sort medical supplies. "Victor was watching from across the street earlier, just standing there, smoking." Nora had seen him. Marco's former right-hand man, now conspicuously absent from the renovation efforts. His cold stare had made her shiver. That afternoon, 2 veterans overheard Victor in the parking lot of Joe's bar. "King's gone soft," he'd growled to a group of leather-clad men. "All that money just given away? There's more to this story than some publicity stunt marriage?" The next day, a manila envelope arrived at the local newspaper office. Inside were grainy photos of motorcycle club meetings and cryptic suggestions about hidden bank accounts. The editor, to his credit, called Samir immediately. "They're trying to spook the banks," Samir explained to Marco and Nora in his office. "Create enough doubt to freeze the trust's assets." The week crawled by with similar small attacks. Missing tools, slashed tires, whispered threats that made volunteers nervous. Hank remained steady through it all. "Been through worse in Fallujah," he'd say, organizing the medical supply storage shed with military precision. The retired Marine had become the heart of the operation, his gruff kindness drawing other veterans to help. Then came Thursday night. Nora was reviewing inventory lists when she smelled smoke. Through the window, she saw orange flames licking up the side of the storage shed where they kept the medical supplies. "Fire!" she screamed, running towards the door. "Someone call 911!" But Hank was already there, throwing open the shed's burning door. "Can't lose these supplies," he shouted, plunging into the smoke. "Some of this stuff's irreplaceable." "Hank, no!" Nora tried to follow, but Marco caught her arm. "Stay back," he ordered, running toward the shed himself. The next few minutes were chaos. Sirens wailed in the distance. Volunteers formed a bucket brigade. Through the smoke, Hank emerged again and again, arms full of boxes, his jacket beginning to smolder. On his final trip, the doorframe caught fire above him. As burning wood crashed down, Hank threw himself over the last box of supplies. His scream cut through the night air. Marco and 2 other men dragged him clear as the fire trucks arrived. Nora's hands shook as she saw the angry red burns on Hank's arms and back. "The supplies," Hank gasped as paramedics worked on him. "Did we save them?" "Most of them," Nora assured him, fighting tears. "You saved them, Hank." Within hours, the trust's main bank account was frozen. An anonymous tip had suggested financial irregularities, and the bank wasn't taking chances. "They planned this," Marco said, his voice dangerous. "The fire, the allegations, it's all connected." At the hospital that night, Nora sat beside Hank's bed. The steady beep of monitors filled the silence as she watched his bandaged chest rise and fall. "You should be sleeping," Hank mumbled, opening one eye. "So should you." Nora adjusted his blanket. "The doctor says you'll recover fully." "Course I will," he grimaced. "Takes more than a little fire to stop an old Marine." Nora took his unbandaged hand. "I'm so sorry this happened." "Don't you dare apologize." Hank's voice was firm despite his pain. "This is exactly why we need this center. Some folks would rather destroy than let good things happen." "I'm scared," Nora admitted. "What if they try again?" "Then we'll be ready." Hank squeezed her hand. Fear's only powerful if you let it win. Nora straightened in her chair, feeling steel enter her spine. They want us to give up, to run away. So what are you going to do about it? Fight back, she said softly. Not with violence, but with truth, with community, with persistence. Hank smiled through his pain. Now you're talking like a Marine. Outside the hospital window, the night was deep and dark, but Nora felt a fierce light growing in her heart, not of fear or anger, but of determination. They would not let fear win. Not today. Not ever. The morning after the fire, sympathy cards and small donations began arriving at the center. Local papers ran front-page photos of Hank being loaded into the ambulance, his burned arms visible beneath the bandages. The headline read, "Local hero saves veterans supplies from arson." "Look at this," Nora said, spreading the newspaper on a folding table. Around her, volunteers swept away ash and sorted through the salvaged medical supplies. "People are finally seeing what we're trying to do here." May nodded, her nurse's eyes assessing the damaged goods. Sometimes it takes a crisis to bring out the best in people. Throughout that first day, more support poured in. A local pharmacy donated basic medical supplies. Church groups brought casseroles. Even the skeptical town council member stopped by with a check and mumbled apologies about his earlier doubts. "This could be our turning point," Rosa said, directing volunteers as they unloaded a truck of donated blankets. "People respect sacrifice. They respect someone willing to get burned protecting others." But by the third day, everything changed. The official freeze notice arrived from First Regional Bank, printed on crisp letterhead. All trust accounts were suspended pending investigation of credible allegations regarding fund sources. Marco slammed his fist against the wall when he read it. "They're trying to strangle us slowly." The conservative donor who'd pledged $50,000 sent a polite email withdrawing his support, citing concerns about organizational stability. That afternoon, Nora overheard heated voices from the break room. Through the crack in the door, she saw several club members confronting Marco. "This soft approach isn't working," one growled. "Let us handle Victor our way." "No," Marco's voice was steel. "We're not going back to that. The old methods got results. The old methods got people hurt," Rosa cut in, stepping between them. "I'm with Marco. We finished this clean." Later, Nora found Rosa in the parking lot, smoking pensively. "Thank you," Nora said, "for standing up for the new direction." Rosa crushed out her cigarette. "Marco saved my life once, not with violence, with kindness. This place, this is who he really is, who we all could be." Determined to keep spirits up, Nora organized an emergency sewing marathon in the center's main room. May brought her quilting frames, and women from 3 church groups arrived with sewing machines and fabric. The gentle whir of machines filled the air as they worked to replace burned bedding and curtains. May demonstrated her special quilting technique, a pattern called Broken Stars Made Whole. "See how the pieces that look broken actually make the pattern stronger," she explained, guiding rough hands through the stitches. "That's what we're doing here, taking broken pieces and making something beautiful." As they worked, stories flowed. A volunteer spoke about her son in Afghanistan. Another shared memories of a father who'd never quite recovered from Vietnam. With each story, more stitches joined piece to piece, creating warmth from fragments. Tommy appeared with sandwiches, his usual swagger subdued. He'd been quiet since the fire, helping without complaint. Now he watched the quilting with unusual focus. "Mom used to make these for the hospital," he said softly to Nora. "Before Dad died. I remember the sound of her sewing machine at night." Nora squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of memory between them. That evening, As volunteers packed up their machines, Nora checked the center's voicemail. The last message made her blood run cold. "Tell your new husband to think carefully." Victor's voice oozed through the speaker. "Is this little charity worth losing everything for? There are still some debts that need paying, one way or another. Tick-tock, Marco." She saved the message with trembling fingers, then found Marco in his office, reviewing paperwork. "Listen," she said, playing the threat back. Marco's face hardened as Victor's voice filled the room. When it finished, he was silent for a long moment. "He's desperate," Marco finally said. "Trying to scare us because he's running out of options." "What does he mean about debts?" Marco ran a hand through his hair. "Old business. Things I'm not proud of. But I meant what I said about changing, about making this place work." Through the window, they could see May teaching one last volunteer the broken star pattern. The setting sun caught the needle's flash as it dipped and rose, slowly creating something whole from scattered pieces. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the veteran's center as Marco worked on the rickety porch steps. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing faded tattoos as he measured and cut replacement boards. Nora watched from the doorway, 2 glasses of fresh lemonade sweating in her hands. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said, offering him a glass. Marco sat back on his heels, wiping his brow. "Thanks." Their fingers brushed as he took the glass, and neither pulled away too quickly. These small moments had been happening more often lately. Shared glances, lingering touches, comfortable silences. "My dad used to fix things around the house," Nora said, settling on the top step. "He always said a home needs constant care, like a garden." Marco nodded, sipping his lemonade. "Smart man. Everything worth keeping needs maintenance." He tested a loose board. "Like relationships." Later that night, after most volunteers had gone home, Nora found Marco in the kitchen, staring at old photographs spread across the table. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Just thinking." He pushed one photo toward her, a younger version of himself in military dress blues, standing with other servicemen. "That's my old unit, before everything went sideways." Nora sat beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "What happened?" "I came back different. Angry. Started running with the wrong crowd because they understood violence." His voice grew soft. "But some veterans from my unit never gave up on me. Especially this guy, Joe. He'd show up every week, talk to me, bring me food, even when I was at my worst." "Is that why you're doing all this?" Marco's hand found hers in the dim light. "Partly. But also because I'm tired of being feared, of living up to that reputation. With you, I feel like maybe I could be someone better." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, nothing like the brutal man the papers described. Nora felt herself melting into it, feeling safe despite everything. But their peaceful week shattered on Thursday morning. The Coast Herald's headline screamed, "King's Charity a criminal enterprise?" Below it, grainy photographs showed supposed ledgers and bank statements suggesting Marco had hidden millions in offshore accounts. "It's all lies," Marco raged, pacing the office. "Victor must have fabricated those documents." But the damage spread like poison. By afternoon, 3 major donors had withdrawn support. The bank called about additional account freezes. Even some volunteers stopped showing up, leaving apologetic messages about ethical concerns. May took the stress hardest. Nora found her mother sitting pale and shaken in the sewing room, pressing one hand to her chest. "I just need to rest," May insisted, but her breathing was labored. The doctor diagnosed anxiety-induced heart palpitations and ordered bed rest. Nora spent that night at the hospital with her mother, watching the monitors beep steadily. Tommy brought coffee and whispered updates. More donations canceled, more suspicious looks from townspeople. "We'll figure it out," Nora said, but her voice lacked conviction. She returned to the center at dawn to find chaos. Smoke still rose from the east wing, where the arsonists had struck overnight. The damage was catastrophic, worse than the previous attack. Where there had been newly painted walls and hopeful signs, now only charred beams remained. Fire investigators picked through the wreckage as reporters clustered at the property line. Nora heard their whispered speculation: insurance fraud, mob violence, karma. "The sprinkler system was disabled," the fire chief reported. "This was professional work." Marco stood silent, his face carved from stone. Rosa worked the phones, trying to salvage what relationships she could. But the tide of public opinion had turned viciously against them. Nora walked alone through the destroyed wing. Ashes drifted like gray snow, settling in her hair and on her clothes. Here was where May had taught quilting. There was where veterans gathered for coffee and conversation. Now it all reeked of smoke and betrayal. She picked up a half-burned photograph from the floor, one of the first group pictures they'd taken of volunteers and veterans together. The edges curled and blackened, but the smiling faces remained visible. All those hopes, all that trust, reduced to ashes in her hands. Exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. She sank down against a sooty wall, not caring about the dirt anymore. The sound of sirens and media vans faded to a distant buzz. Everything they'd built, everything they'd dreamed of creating here, it felt like trying to hold on to smoke. A teenager's voice carried through a broken window. "Guess they were right about those bikers. Once a criminal, always a criminal." Nora pressed her hands against her eyes, feeling the grit of ash on her skin. She'd believed in Marco's redemption, in the power of second chances. Now she sat in the ruins of that belief, too tired even for tears. The morning sun filtered through smoke-stained windows as Marco laid out his proposal. "We could leave tonight, start fresh somewhere else. I've got enough stored away to—" "No." Nora's voice was quiet but firm, her hands, still grimy with yesterday's ashes, clenched into fists. "Running won't fix this. They're trying to destroy everything we built," Marco argued. "The press, the banks, Victor, they all want us to fail. Then we fight back, the right way." Nora stood, brushing soot from her dress. "We need help, Marco. Real help, from people who know how to expose lies." Within an hour, she had assembled an unlikely team in the center's remaining intact office. Samir sat, with his legal pad, his usual neat appearance rumpled from a sleepless night. Reverend Elsie perched on a folding chair, her gray hair escaping its bun. Rosa leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while June, a former tabloid writer who'd been hovering around the story, completed their circle. "I was pressured to run similar hit pieces before," June explained, twisting a pen between her fingers. "The documents they're using? Something's off about them. The formatting, the dates, it doesn't add up." Samir nodded. "I can subpoena the original bank records. If these leaked documents are forgeries, we'll prove it." "Victor's been meeting old contacts at the Rusty Anchor," Rosa added. "My people say he's throwing money around, bragging about some big score coming." They divided tasks with careful precision. June arranged a meeting with her former editor, promising exclusive access to Marco's real financial records. Rosa deployed her network of loyal veterans to watch Victor's movements. Samir disappeared into his office with stacks of legal documents and bank statements. By sunset, the first pieces fell into place. June's editor, over whiskey and guilt, admitted the leaked documents had arrived through unusual channels. "Anonymous source, heavy pressure from above to run it without fact-checking. Never sat right with me." Rosa's surveillance caught Victor making 3 calls from a payphone near the hospital, calls that coincided with the timing of both arsons. A homeless veteran who slept behind the building remembered seeing Victor's distinctive motorcycle the night of the second fire. Samir emerged from his paper fortress with triumph in his tired eyes. The timestamps on these digital documents show manipulation. Someone altered the dates after the fact. Sloppy work. They forgot about metadata. That evening, Nora sat in the sewing room, carefully stitching letters onto a white banner for the upcoming public hearing. May watched from her chair, still weak, but determined to help. "You're using the double-stitch method," May observed. "That's strong. It'll hold." "Like us," Nora replied, guiding the needle through fabric. "We're going to hold too." The banner took shape under her careful hands. "Truth will stand." Simple words, but watching them emerge in neat blue stitches gave her hope. Each piece of evidence was like another stitch, small but vital, building something stronger than fear. Tommy appeared with sandwiches and news. June found another witness, someone who saw Victor destroying security cameras before the first arson. Nora nodded, continuing her steady stitching. Outside, she could hear Rosa organizing veterans for tomorrow's canvassing, gathering statements, building support. In his office, Samir's light still burned as he prepared legal documents. The moon rose over their damaged but defiant center. Nora tied off her last stitch, holding up the banner to check her work. Tomorrow they would begin presenting their evidence, standing together against the lies. Not with violence or threats, but with truth. Carefully gathered, meticulously proven, strong as the stitches holding her banner together. Marco appeared in the doorway, his expression softening at the sight of her work. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "This is how we fight," Nora replied, running her hand over the finished letters. "This is how we win." The next 4 days blurred together in a frenzy of preparation. Samir's office became command central, stacked with legal papers and coffee cups. His secretary could barely keep up as he dictated motion after motion. "We need to establish pattern and intent," he explained, circling key phrases in red ink. Victor's presence at both arsons, the altered documents, the timing of the smear campaign, it all connects. Reverend Elsie worked the phones tirelessly, her gentle voice carrying surprising authority. "This isn't about taking sides," she told each caller. "It's about standing up for truth. Will you testify about the good you've seen at the center?" The responses surprised them. Veterans who'd found hope, families touched by the trust's work, even skeptics who'd changed their minds after seeing real changes. Each yes was another small victory. Hank insisted on writing his statement from his hospital bed, his burned hands shaking but determined. "Victor came by 3 times before the fire," he dictated to Nora. "Said we were betraying the old ways. Said there'd be consequences if Marco didn't wise up." The effort exhausted him, but he refused to rest until every detail was recorded. Conrad, the thwarted developer, took to the airwaves with smooth confidence. "This so-called trust is a sham," his voice oozed through local radio. "Marco King is using it to launder money and avoid taxes. I have experts ready to testify." Nora clicked off the radio, her hands trembling with anger. But there wasn't time for anger. May needed her. The hospital corridors felt endless as Nora hurried to her mother's room. May lay pale against white sheets, monitors beeping steadily. The doctor's words hung heavy. Stress-induced hypertension. She needs rest, quiet, and no more shocks. "I'm sorry," Nora whispered, holding her mother's thin hand. "I never meant for this to hurt you." May's fingers tightened weakly. "You're doing what's right. That's what matters. Promise me you'll see it through." "I promise, Mama. We're gathering proof. The truth will come out." Rosa's contribution came on the 3rd day. She cornered Joey, a former club member, outside his garage. "You were Victor's right hand for years," she said. "You know what he's really doing." Joey wiped grease from his hands, not meeting her eyes. "I got a family now, Rosa. Can't get involved. So do all those veterans we're trying to help. You want their families to suffer because you're scared?" The silence stretched. Finally, Joey reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small recorder. "Victor likes to brag when he drinks. Caught this 2 weeks ago. Didn't know what to do with it." The recording was scratchy, but clear enough. Victor's voice, thick with alcohol, laying out his plan to discredit Marco, forge documents, and pressure the bank to freeze assets. "Once it all falls apart," he slurred, "we'll buy the property cheap through Conrad. Split the profits 4 ways." On the 4th morning, the legal notice arrived by courier. Nora read it aloud to their gathered team. Notice of public hearing. King's Veterans Trust. Date, 10 days hence. Location, Town Hall, Main Chamber. Purpose, review of evidence regarding asset verification and criminal allegations. Note, proceedings to be televised per public interest requirements. Samir cleared his throat. The bank's lawyer called. If we can't prove the allegations false and establish the trust's legitimacy, they'll begin liquidation proceedings the next day. The room fell silent. 4 days of work had brought them this far. Witnesses gathered, evidence collected, motions filed. Now they had 10 days to prepare for the moment that would either save or destroy everything they'd built. Nora looked around at their tired faces. Samir with ink-stained fingers, Rosa's determined scowl, Reverend Elsie's quiet strength, June's nervous energy. Even Tommy had pitched in, running errands and copying documents. The hearing notice crinkled in her hands. 10 days to prepare their defense. 10 days to save the trust. 10 days to prove that redemption was possible and truth could triumph over lies. Marco stood in the doorway, watching her. She remembered their first meeting, how she'd feared him. Now she saw past his tough exterior to the man who'd risked everything to do something good. They'd face this challenge like they'd faced every other, together, with truth as their shield. The 10 days before the hearing stretched out like a held breath. Each morning, Nora woke to find more volunteers at the center's doors, painters with leftover supplies, retired nurses offering free hours, teenagers willing to clean. "We can't pay you," she'd explain, standing on the creaky porch. "The bank freeze." "Didn't come to get paid," was the common reply. "Came to help." Local businesses stepped up in unexpected ways. The hardware store extended credit for essential repairs. The diner sent over day-old bread and soup. Mrs. Chen from the fabric shop donated bolts of clean cotton for bedding. Marco spent these days on the road, visiting veterans he'd wronged in his darker times. He returned each evening dusty and quiet, but something in his eyes had softened. "Found Jimmy Martinez today," he told Nora on the 4th night, his voice rough. "He was living in his car after the VA denied his claim. We had a bad history. But he listened, even agreed to testify about how the club used to help veterans before things went wrong." Nora squeezed his hand. "That took courage." "Not courage, duty. Should have done it years ago." While they worked to save the trust, Victor moved like a shadow through town. June, their journalist ally, reported whispered meetings in back rooms. "He's gathering supporters," she warned. "People who lost money when Marco changed things." Rosa kept watch on Victor's movements, her network of loyal friends reporting every suspicious gathering. "He's planning something big for the hearing," she said, "but we can't prove what." On day 6, an unexpected ray of hope arrived. Sarah Chen, daughter of the fabric shop owner, appeared at the center clutching a business card. My boss at Chentech wants to help, she explained. She saw your interview about second chances. The corporate check that followed made Nora's eyes water, enough to keep basic services running for months if they won the hearing. But victories were balanced with worries. May's recovery remained slow. Nora visited the hospital daily, watching her mother's pale face and willing her to get stronger. The doctor says my blood pressure's still too high, May admitted. But don't you dare feel guilty, baby. This fight matters. Tommy threw himself into helping, perhaps trying to make up for his role in starting everything. He organized other teenagers to clean the grounds, plant flowers, make the place look cared for despite its troubles. The community organized small fundraisers, bake sales, car washes, craft fairs. None raised much money, but each showed support. Reverend Elsie called them seeds of hope. Samir worked late into each night, organizing their evidence. June's investigation had uncovered patterns in the forged documents, timestamps that didn't match, signatures that showed signs of digital manipulation. It's not a slam dunk, Samir cautioned, but it's enough to raise serious doubts about Victor's claims. On the 9th day, Rosa intercepted a troubling message. Victor's people are planning to pack the hearing, she reported. Bring in outsiders to make noise, disrupt testimony. We'll be ready, Marco said simply. His calm seemed to steady everyone. That final night, Nora couldn't sleep. She found Marco walking the hospital grounds under a bright moon. Together they traced the paths where healing would happen, if they succeeded. Are you afraid? She asked. Marco considered before answering. Not of Victor, not of losing face or money, just of failing the people who trusted us to make this work. We have the truth, Nora said. Truth's not always enough. It has to be. All these people believing in us, helping us, they see the truth. Tomorrow we just have to help others see it too. They walked in silence, their shadows stretching long in the moonlight. The old hospital waited patient and dark, holding its secrets and its promise. Tomorrow would decide its fate. In her small room later, Nora lay awake watching moonlight paint patterns on the wall. Down the hall she could hear Marco's heavy footsteps as he too paced, unable to rest. All their preparation, all their hopes, would face their test when the sun rose. The town hall's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as cameras clicked and whirred. Every wooden bench groaned under the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the morning sky like metal flowers. Nora's hands trembled as she smoothed her simple dress, the same one she'd mended the day Rosa first appeared at their door. It felt like years ago now, though barely 2 months had passed. The hearing officer, Judge Martinez, tapped his gavel. His weathered face showed no emotion as he called the first witness. Samir stood, straightening his tie. I call Mr. James Peterson, former contributor to the Daily Herald. The tabloid source shuffled forward. Under Samir's careful questioning, his story began to crumble. And these documents, you claim they came directly from club records? Peterson's eyes darted to Victor in the third row. Well, did someone provide these to you? Perhaps with financial incentive? I was told. Peterson swallowed hard. I was told to run the story or face consequences. June took the stand next, her journalist's notebook clutched tight. I traced the metadata on those documents. They were created 3 days after the trust was announced, not years ago as claimed. The signatures show digital manipulation. The crowd murmured. Victor's face darkened. Rosa's testimony hit harder. She played the audio recording, Victor's voice clear and cold. We'll burn it all down if we have to. Marco's gone soft. Time to take back what's ours. Hank wheeled himself forward, his burns still healing. I saw Victor that night, running from the storage shed fire, recognized his limp from an old injury. Through it all, Marco sat stone-faced, his fingers locked together. Only Nora saw how his knuckles whitened at each revelation. When Marco finally took the stand, the room fell silent. "My brother Jimmy came home broken," he began, his voice rough. "Vietnam changed him. I promised to help, to make things right. But I was young, angry, building the club instead. The day he died..." Marco paused, fighting for control. "The day he died, I swore I'd do better. But I didn't. More vets came asking for help. I turned away, built power instead of purpose." He looked directly at Victor. "You want to know why I gave it all away? Because power without purpose is poison. Because every vet I failed to help was another brother lost." Nora touched the old Bible in her lap, her father's note tucked inside. When called, she read it aloud with a steady voice. "Marco's father saved my life in Korea. When he heard I couldn't afford my daughter's medicine, he paid the bill. No conditions, no debt, just one soldier helping another. That's the real Valente Code. Not power, but service." Victor surged to his feet. "This is theater. Marco's gone weak, throwing away everything we built." But his outburst backfired. 3 former club members stood up from different corners of the room. "Victor offered us money to lie," one announced. "Said he'd make us rich if we helped take Marco down." "Showed us where to plant the forged papers," another added. "Told us which reporters to threaten," said the third. Judge Martinez's gavel cracked like thunder. "I've heard enough. The trust's funds are unfrozen pending full audit. Mr. Victor Rossi will be investigated for fraud, arson, and witness tampering." The crowd erupted. Veterans hugged. Reporters rushed for phones. Through tears, Nora saw Tommy punching the air while May beamed from her wheelchair. Later, as sunset painted the town hall steps golden, the core group gathered. No champagne or loud celebration. They were too tired, too aware of work ahead. But hope filled the air like music. "The real fight starts now," Samir cautioned. "Building something lasting." Rosa nodded. "Better than tearing things down." Marco stood slightly apart, watching the crowd disperse. Nora joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing there was something worth saving." "There always was," she replied. "In the trust, in you." Above them, the first stars appeared, bright against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they had won the chance to prove that redemption was possible, that broken things could be rebuilt, that service was stronger than power. 2 months after the hearing, the Veterans Hospital grounds hummed with activity. The summer sun beat down on fresh paint and newly installed windows, warming the rebuilt West Wing that now stood stronger than before. Nora walked the halls, clipboard in hand, checking off items on her daily rounds. The transformation still amazed her. Where charred beams had once gaped at the sky, sturdy walls now housed classrooms and therapy spaces. The acrid smell of smoke had given way to fresh lumber and the quiet whir of air conditioning. "Looking good, isn't it?" Hank wheeled up beside her, his burns healing well enough that he only needed minimal bandages now. His workshop was in full swing, teaching other disabled veterans how to adapt everyday tasks. "The grant money made all the difference," Nora agreed, pausing to watch through an open door where 6 veterans practiced using modified tools. "How's the new equipment working out?" "Better than we hoped. That corporate donation bought us top-of-the-line adaptive devices. Had 3 guys learn to cook again last week." Outside in the parking lot, Rosa's voice carried over the sound of engines. She stood surrounded by former club members, now enrolled in her certified mechanics program. They bent over the engine of a customized motorcycle, modified to carry medical supplies to homebound veterans. "Check the fuel injection again," Rosa instructed, pointing with a wrench. "These mobile units need to run perfect when they're delivering supplies." The scene brought a smile to Nora's face. 10 of Marco's former crew had traded their club patches for student IDs, working toward legitimate certifications. The technical college had been skeptical at first, but their dedication proved genuine. In the community room, May presided over her twice-weekly quilting circle. Her health had improved enough that she could teach for several hours, showing both veterans and family members how to piece together comfort from scraps. "Each stitch is healing," May often said, and Nora saw the truth of it in the faces around the table, concentrated, peaceful, connected by shared purpose and thread. Marco had his own transformation. He'd formally dissolved the old club structure, transferring remaining assets into the trust. Now he worked alongside everyone else, often in simple jeans and work shirts instead of leather. The respect he commanded came not from fear, but from steady, humble service. The grant paperwork came through, he told Nora that afternoon, finding her in the office they shared. "Full funding for the next year's programs. And Victor accepted a plea deal. He'll be in prison for at least 5 years. Marco ran a hand through his hair, shorter now and graying at the temples. "Conrad's development company is under investigation, too. Turns out he tried bribing 3 different officials to block our permits." The community open house was planned for exactly 2 months after the hearing. Tables loaded with potluck dishes lined the parking lot. Veterans and townspeople mingled freely, many wearing name tags decorated by the Children's Art Therapy Group. A makeshift stage held a microphone where people took turns sharing stories. A former Marine described learning to walk again with Hank's help. A club member turned student mechanic spoke about finding honest purpose. May's quilting students displayed their work, each piece containing messages of hope stitched into the patterns. "Remember when this place was just a broken shell?" Rosa asked, joining Nora by the punch bowl. "Now look at it." Nora did look, taking in every detail, the fresh paint gleaming in the evening light, the wheelchair ramps and handrails installed with careful precision, the garden where therapy groups grew vegetables and flowers. Most of all, she saw the people, moving freely between groups that once eyed each other with suspicion, sharing food and conversation with easy familiarity. Marco found her as the sun began to set. Together they stood at the edge of the gathering, partners in more ways than either had imagined possible that first tense day of their arranged marriage. "Thank you," he said simply, echoing words from the hearing, but with deeper meaning now. "For seeing what this could become." Around them, the community celebration continued, a testament to redemption made real through daily acts of service and trust. 3 months after the community open house, autumn sunlight streamed through the center's tall windows, casting warm patterns across quilts that now decorated every wall. Each handmade blanket told a story, some stitched by veterans learning to use their hands again, others crafted by families finding healing through shared work. The lunch line stretched past the newly installed cafeteria doors. The aroma of homemade soup filled the air as May, now strong enough to volunteer 3 days a week, ladled portions into bowls. Veterans chatted easily with townspeople, their conversations punctuated by occasional laughter. Outside, a gleaming motorcycle, one of Rosa's restoration projects, purred to life. A former club member, now a certified EMT, secured a first aid kit to the custom rack before heading out for home wellness checks. Nora stood in her office, reviewing supply orders with newfound confidence. The frightened young woman who'd once trembled at Marco's door had grown into a capable administrator. She approved funding for additional therapy equipment, her signature flowing smoothly across the page. "Got those maintenance reports you wanted," Marco said, entering with a stack of papers. He'd traded his leather jacket for a simple work shirt, though his eyes still held that quiet intensity. But now it was focused on service rather than control. In the common room, they found May teaching a new quilting student while Rosa organized the next day's outreach schedule. The scene was so peaceful, so far from those first tense days, that Nora felt her heart swell. "Tea?" she offered her mother, heading to the small kitchen they'd installed for family gatherings. Marco followed, carrying a jacket with a torn sleeve. "Let me fix that," he said, pulling out a sewing kit. His large hands moved with surprising gentleness as he repaired the tear. They'd both learned new ways of mending: fabric, relationships, lives. Nora's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. He'd been promoted at the construction company where he'd found steady work. "Starting supervisor training next month," she read aloud, smiling. "Your brother's come a long way," Marco observed, tying off his final stitch. Rosa appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. As outreach director, she managed a growing network of services. "We've got 3 new volunteers signed up for the mobile clinic," she reported, "and Hank's getting that award next week." The Community Hero ceremony would honor Hank's work with disabled veterans. His adaptive workshops had already helped dozens of former service members regain independence. Samir dropped by that afternoon for his weekly legal check-in. The lawyer who'd helped save the center now served on its advisory board. "It's remarkable," he said, watching veterans and volunteers move through their daily routines. "How justice and mercy found common ground here." A breeze carried the sound of hammers from the workshop, where Rosa's mechanics class was building custom mobility equipment. The scent of fresh paint drifted from the art therapy room. Someone's guitar played softly in the counseling wing. Through the front windows, Nora could see the flag they'd raised on opening day. The words, "The King's Pledge," rippled in gold thread against blue fabric, her own needlework marking their commitment to service. Below it, a group of veterans sat with their families, sharing stories and coffee in the afternoon sun. "Sometimes I still can't believe how it all turned out," May said, joining Nora at the window. "From that terrible morning when Rosa brought that envelope." Nora nodded, remembering her fear and anger at the forced marriage. The debt that had seemed like a death sentence had somehow grown into this, a place of healing, of second chances, of community reborn. Marco's hand found hers, warm and steady. Together they watched their unlikely family, Rosa directing volunteers, Hank leading a therapy session, May comforting a veteran's worried wife. The sound of mingled laughter floated up from the garden where Tommy had once hidden in shame. The marriage that began as a bargain had seeded something far greater than any of them could have imagined. Where there had been broken trust, now stood a testament to redemption. Where fear once ruled, hope had taken root and flourished. Through the open windows came the steady sound of heartbeats finding their rhythm, in shared work, in restored dignity, in the simple act of showing up day after day to help one another heal.